Hey everybody, welcome back to another reaction video. Today I wanted to check out another video from Elephants in the Room with LaCorte, and I've really appreciated his channel in the short time I've been watching him. His objective seems to be a lot like mine, which is to bring nuance to historical topics. Now, of course, there's always like nuance to the nuance, which is why we should never stop learning. And we should never stop questioning what we think about, especially when it comes to history. Anyway, this video is titled, Why the Founding Fathers Chose Slavery. Definitely something that should bring in a lot of nuance. I'm going to link the original down below. Make sure you're supporting that. Let's see what we got. Now, of course, slavery was already a major institution in North America by the time the founding fathers and creation of the United States happens in the 1770s into the 80s with the Constitution, going back to some of the earliest settlers of North America in the 1600s. And usually find the longer an institution has lasted, the harder it is to remove it. But let's look at what I guess can be seen as the actual backing behind it. Let's see what Ken's got.
Wrote all men are created. Thomas Jefferson wrote all men are created equal, along with some of the most beautiful prose ever written about liberty, self-governance, and the natural rights of man.
Sure. He was an Enlightenment thinker. He's well educated. Like the many the founding fathers were reading the Enlightenment philosophies that were coming out of Europe, many of which advocated for American independence, but a little bit complicated with someone like Jefferson, one of the biggest slave owners of all.
He also ran a nail factory at Monticello with child slaves as young as 10 years old. He wrote that 2 months of
and some were his own children.
Labor by the nail boys paid his family's grocery bill for a year. That's the contradiction most people know. And it's also where most people stop, either to condemn the founders as monsters or completely excuse them as men of their time. But here's the harder question. Why did they choose to protect slavery in the Constitution? And what would have happened if they'd chosen differently?
Well, that is an interesting thought. If you're thinking that from the perspective of the 1780s with the Constitution, one of two things could probably happen. You'd have the creation of two states, two United States, a northern and a southern. Just happens like that, with the South probably protecting slavery and the North maybe not. Or Civil War right away. That seems like two alternatives. Having it just immediately off the board from the get-go without any major ramifications? No way.
The answers aren't black and white. I'm Ken LaCorte. I dig into uncomfortable topics to try and figure out the real story. Not to make anyone feel good or bad about the past, but because the truth is always more interesting than the simplified versions we learn. We'll start with a look at the slaveholding founders.
That's why I love history.
And then broaden that out with a look at slavery's long history. Because the United States was a small part of that story.
Right.
Then we'll get into the price of a country and the political realities that the founding fathers faced.
Okay.
And finally, what if they'd refused and there was no deal? Okay. By the end, I think you'll know things that most people miss entirely about how America began. So let's...
That's fair. I mean, as with most history, people are very uninformed, or they just let kind of just modern society, I guess, just kind of interpret it from there, whatever the common opinion is, you know. Okay, what do we got?
Turn to the slaveholding founders, because it wasn't just a few one-offs who were part of it.
Right.
The American Revolution, it wasn't organized or led by poor farmers or laborers. It was led by the elites, the wealthiest and most educated men in the colonies, lawyers, plantation owners, merchants. About 40% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves.
Now, it was the strongest in urban areas, the growing urban America, because that's the place where they dealt with the British the most. It's in the port cities, right? Places like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, of course, being the biggest one, the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere. Right. That's where you really came toe to toe and where the biggest grievances were. And yeah, the organization, it was wealthy guys. A guy like Paul Revere is one of the wealthiest guys in Boston with incredible connections. Those are the guys doing that. I mean, you got the Boston Tea Party, which was also done by elites, urban elites, especially. Now, that was a great, there was also relationships. If you were like a, cotton producer or something, you did plenty of business, obviously, because you were exporting to the British, but not necessarily at the most competitive prices because they were the British colonies. You couldn't be trading on an open market to get the best prices with, say, like a France or Spain or something like that. You were confined to, having to just trade with the British.
And at the Constitutional Convention, a decade later, almost half owned slaves. They weren't just tolerating a system they inherited. Many of them built their fortunes on it. George Washington owned more than 300 slaves at Mount Vernon.
Heard a lot from his wife's side.
Thomas Jefferson enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime. Slavery was embedded in the economy, the social structure, and the daily lives of the political class.
No doubt.
And it funded their livelihoods.
Sure.
And while slavery operated in the South, it also helped Northern merchants. Northern ships carried slaves. Distilleries produced the rum traded for slaves in West Africa.
Sure.
And their textile mills, they ran on Southern cotton.
Sure.
The Northern economy was entangled with slavery.
Now that really picks up with the Industrial Revolution, though, of really starting to do that, because so much of the raw stuff was exported to Britain because they industrialized first, and the Industrial Revolution was built on textile manufacturing to clothe the growing population of Britain.
They ran on Southern cotton. The Northern economy was entangled with slavery, even in states that were abolishing it. President Washington, while serving in Philadelphia, he orchestrated a rotation scheme to move slaves out of Pennsylvania every 6 months to prevent them from claiming freedom under state law. When his enslaved cook Hercules escaped, Washington tried to have him hunted down. When another slave, Ona Judge, escaped during a family dinner, Washington used his presidential power to go after her. He sent customs officers and told the agents to seize her by surprise because he knew if she got advanced warning, she'd disappear.
Now, if you're not American or a little bit rusty on American history and stuff, the whole fugitive slave thing was a kind of a controversial thing that had to end up going to the Supreme Court. Fugitive Slave Act gets passed, but the idea that if a slave escapes, it's a fugitive, right, and enters into a non-slave state or a place where slavery has been banned, that does not make that person, enslaved person, free. In fact, they need to be returned back to the state and to the owner.
Thomas Jefferson called slavery a moral depravity and an abominable crime, then went home to Monticello and ran a plantation empire built entirely on forced labor.
And again, forced himself onto some of the female slaves that he ends up having children with. And some of them he didn't even free.
He fathered children with slave Sally Hemings, and when he died, his estate sold 130 slaves at auction to pay his debts. Benjamin Franklin owned slaves for decades and advertised their sale in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette.
That's not one you hear
about
much.
Later in life, he became an abolitionist and headed the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, one of the first organizations in America dedicated to ending slavery. His final public act before dying in 1790 was unsuccessfully petitioning Congress to abolish slavery. Still, most of these men made
now,
personal
one of my favorite videos that I have seen and watched recently was from Ken, and that was the why did slavery actually end? And I loved it because it took an approach that not a lot of people think about. People like to go straight to the moral depravity of slavery and say that is what inspired more than anything the end of slavery. And that just wasn't the case. It was more economic than anything. The Industrial Revolution is the biggest thing that put to the end of slavery. Otherwise, it would have ended way before that. It was not just because of a moral change of heart that was attached to the de-incentivizing of using slave labor as an opposed to industrializing.
Every single day, slavery. Still, most of these men made personal choices every single day to keep owning people. And if you stop your history lesson looking at those actions and that hypocrisy, it's rational to come to the conclusion that they were horrible humans and that all that talk about liberty and equality was a great big scam. But pulling our focus out a bit, that'll give us some more context to judge that better.
My favorite word, context.
Everything in life is more complicated than it looks at first. Now, look, it's weird that I even have to say this, but surveys say otherwise. Slavery wasn't invented in the Americas or even by white people.
Of course.
Not by a long shot.
I actually don't think anybody thinks this, really. I think that's overblown, to be honest. I deal, obviously, with hundreds of kids every year of teenagers, and none of them come in thinking that. I don't know where this came from, if they do think it's common.
Slavery's long history essentially goes back as long as humanity. The Greeks did it. The Romans did it. The Chinese, the Arabs, Africans, even Catholic popes had slaves. Heck, at least one pope had actually been a slave. Virtually every society on earth had some form of slavery. And nobody...
Young people, do you know Roots? Do you know what Roots is? Like, we watched it in like 6th grade, like the whole series. It's always memorable to hear, the Kunta Kinte, and he's, whipping him in the back. But it was just like mandatory. We watched it. I think it was 6th grade.
Virtually every society on Earth had some form of slavery, and nobody seemed to think twice about it. Now, there's an argument, and it has some merit, that the slavery that came to the Americas was more brutal than the slavery beforehand. Chattel slavery. That essentially means human beings who are legally classified as property.
Yeah. And it could be sold as property. And also the children of slaves are also considered slaves, which is not always the system that has happened historically. So I think that term chattel slavery is important to actually use, because slavery is actually a very diverse thing.
Those slaves had no path
when you talk
to
about
freedom,
definitions and
slavery
types.
was passed down through their children. And in the Americas, it was also tied to race, making it especially hard to escape from.
Yeah, because that wasn't always necessarily the case, especially if you're talking about like the Romans and stuff like that, when it's a lot more about captives. But it could also be on religious grounds, because the Islamic slave trade included enslaving people from non-Islamic lands, because you're not allowed to enslave another Muslim. So they went either into Orthodox Christian Europe to get slaves, or sub-Saharan Africa.
That said, we don't have much insight to what life was like for ancient slaves in Egypt or Rome. But the horrors of American slavery, they're well documented because it's more recent. Right. We kept meticulous records like plantation ledgers, slave auctions, and advertisements. And
writings from slaves, especially around the time when abolition happened. A guy like Frederick Douglass. Guys go and write, about their experiences.
Runaway notices in newspapers. And the stories of slaves themselves made it vivid and clear in a way that ancient slavery just can't be. What we definitely know, though, is that the Atlantic slave trade industrialized slavery in a way the world had never seen.
Sure. Yeah. It was a pipeline that went on for centuries. Come out of Africa, right? So enslaved generally by other African nations in their wars, and it was very profitable for them. Sell them to Europeans, and then shipped to the Americas, where they went to a lot of different places. And we'll see if he gets to it. But when you actually look at the large percentage of slaves that came across the Atlantic, it's pretty small that actually went to the British northern colonies of what would eventually be the United States. You're only talking about 5% or so, which is pretty amazing, because think about how vast and deep the history of slavery is on the history of the country. But, the majority of slaves went to either Brazil or the Caribbean, where local populations were completely decimated, and slaves are going to, replace that. Now, in a lot of, like Spanish America, is in the Spanish Empire, there were still quite large indigenous populations, and they had their own form of basically coerced labor with like the encomienda system and developing haciendas.
The numbers were massive, especially for the time. About 12 million Africans were forced onto slave ships between 1500 and the 1800s. About 2 million of them died on the journey over. Yep. It was simply horrific.
Yeah. And that was a lot more early on. Early on, slave traders were basically just trying to maximize their profits by jamming as many slaves as they could on a ship without really taking care of them, in the sense that, any losses they have because of the disease and malnutrition and stuff like that happens on the Middle Passage, they were hoping to make that up just by sheer numbers. And that wasn't the case. So slowly, because you're talking about a couple centuries here, the conditions, I guess, get a little bit better. And that mortality rate started to lower. It was down to probably about 5%. When at a time, at its height, it was, almost like a quarter, I believe, of slaves died on the passage.
And interestingly, though, only about 3.5%, like 1 in 28, landed in what would eventually become the United States. Mm-hmm. The rest were scattered across the Caribbean and South America, especially
to do sugar. Because that was, early on, that was the most labor intensive, profitable product was sugar. So why not in North America? Well, it's because sugar can't grow there. You need the tropical climates of the Caribbean and of Brazil, which is why you get the highest percentages going there. Sorry, I was talking
eventually
over
become
Ken.
The United States. The rest were scattered across the Caribbean and South America, especially Brazil, which brought in 4 to 5 million Africans, about 10 times more than the United States itself. But as that trade was flourishing, human morality was starting to change. In the late 1600s, intellectuals like John Locke and Voltaire, they laid the groundwork for the ideas of liberty, natural rights, universal reason, the concepts that challenged the established hierarchy. And religion also played a real role in that as well. The evangelical revival of the 1700s saw a surge of emotional, populist Christianity, what historians call the Great Awakening.
Yeah, no, largely in the northern states like New York and New England. You also got spawning of new religions where like the Mormon Church came out of, for example.
In America, many northern abolitionists were products of that movement, and they took it as a duty to fight. That theological divide split national churches right down the middle. And the moral turnaround happened quickly. Just a few decades beforehand, most churches were either silent on slavery or totally complicit. And
right, I was going to say, like, go down to the South, going out to like the Baptist Convention, they justified it. It was like, you know, the Christian churches in America both use Christianity to condemn and condone it. I hope he does get into the economic influences for the end of slavery, because he did a whole video on it.
And then it wasn't too long before they were sending missionaries to preach against it and organizing boycotts. Of course, very few of the people who supported slavery saw themselves as the bad guys. I mean, people just don't do that. That's not how human brains work. They often cited the Bible as support, from the curse of Ham in Genesis to Paul's letters instructing servants to obey their masters. There was also racial science, which tried to prove that Africans were biologically suited for servitude.
Yeah, you get that with the social Darwinism and the other biological, like, kind of bastardizations that were happening in the early fields of biology, evolution, things like that.
And then there was a paternalistic belief that they were essentially benevolent caretakers of a race that was incapable of governing itself.
That they were doing them a favor by their they're civilizing them.
They argued that their slaves were fed, housed, and cared for in old age better than their counterparts across the ocean, and often better than the industrial workers in the North who worked themselves to death with no long-term security.
Regardless of, though, if they're not being asked to be coerced like this, though. And better than the industrial workers in the North who work themselves to death with no long-term security. That's cope.
So when the American founders were meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, slavery wasn't just some unique American evil. It had been a standard practice of every major empire and most of the world's economies. The question wasn't whether slavery was normal. It was. The question was whether the new country would be different. And it's also good to remember that essentially everyone, even abolitionists, had views on race that would be considered monstrous today.
Yeah, and a lot of them that wanted to abolish slavery also didn't necessarily say that the races were equal. Shoot, Abraham Lincoln said that in debate.
Heck, Abraham Lincoln, 70 years later at the
Stephen A. Douglas debate. Yeah.
He explained that he wasn't in favor of bringing in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races.
Right.
He made it clear that blacks shouldn't vote, serve on juries, hold office, or intermarry with whites.
Now, is this more just like politically expedient that he'd be seen too radical? You know, to just clamor for full equality? Was this more like political posturing? What was deeply in the mind of Lincoln? I don't know. I mean, nothing wrong with taking him at his word, though.
And he was the anti-slavery guy who essentially did more than any other American to end slavery.
Well, and he, in the rising up in the political career, though, just said he didn't want slavery to expand. Right. When he's elected, he's like, slavery is going to be able to exist where it does. But this was in the era of Western expansion. So new states are being created. His idea was that it shouldn't spread. That's what he said going into it, even with the presidential election. And that was not enough, right, for the southern states to really believe it and, of course, secede before he was even inaugurated. But that was what he was saying his platform was, though. Just don't spread it. But it can persist where it is. So it's easy to look back and sort history into good guys and bad guys. It's also too simple. And to be honest, you and I aren't getting off the hook. Do you own a smartphone? Well, they have a few grams of cobalt in them. And most of that comes from the Congo, where tens of thousands of young kids work in mines in horrific conditions. Heck, I live in a wealthy American city where I drive by people in obvious distress and I do nothing. If they had a broken leg, I'd stop traffic to get them help. But instead, they have something wrong with their brain, and our society essentially enables them to keep living in misery. Values change, and someday we may all be the bad guys. Now, that doesn't erase the brutality. Yeah, and I'm sure future generations will think of you and me as bad guys, that there was something we were not doing enough of when it comes to equality or something. I don't know if that maybe motivates you for help you more with social issues, or are you just going to be, I am what I am, or I am product of my time?
Brutality of slavery, where someday we may all be the bad guys. Now, that doesn't erase the brutality of slavery, where children were sold from their mothers, but it gives perspective. So when you look at history like this, you can see that sometimes macroeconomic changes can happen pretty quickly. I was recently on the phone with a nationally known financial commentator who is absolutely convinced that both the stock market and the real estate are in massive bubbles about to pop.
Okay.
Is he right? I have no idea.
Sponsors?
I've heard smart people say that a lot, but sometimes they're right. That's why smarter people who've saved some money don't just chase the highest returns, they diversify. And they diversify into baskets that aren't all likely to get hit and drop together.
I'm waiting for the sponsor.
For many of them, one of those baskets is gold. Today's sponsor, it's Augusta Precious Metals.
That was a good segue.
And they make buying physical gold easy.
I caught on to it.
That takes expertise. They store it under your
My
name in a
segues
bonded
for
facility.
sponsors are
They help you own
usually
it
pretty
legally
lame,
inside
I'll be
of an
honest.
IRA with the tax advantages that go along with that. Their fees are reasonable. I even did a video conference and saw that it was solid, useful information, and there was zero sales pressure. Augusta's been around for about a decade.
People still buying up gold.
Great. So if you've been thinking at all about investing in gold, check them out, see if it makes sense for you.
So much of that, I feel like, is based off of just this idea that eventually our money system is going to collapse and we'll go back to gold. And those sitting on them gold bars are going to, reign king once again, like their ancestors.
Go to kenforgold.com or text
or in crypto
to
collapses
35052 for more info. Now back to some history. So as I mentioned, America's founding fathers were enmeshed with slavery, but they were also the generation that built a bridge from a world with slaves to a country without them. And they did that through something we tend to
80 years apart
consider dirty: politics. So to understand the price of a country, let's go back to 1787.
80 years and a war.
The American Revolution had ended 4 years earlier. 13 British colonies had just won their independence and needed to figure out how to govern themselves. They originally tried the Articles of Confederation.
Yep.
Basically a loose alliance where each state stayed mostly independent. Congress couldn't collect taxes, so there was no money to pay soldiers or debts. Laws couldn't be enforced across state lines. They even printed their own money and taxed goods from other states. And some of these states were negotiating separate deals with Britain and France. Britain still had troops in Canada and forts on American soil. The European powers were watching to see if the new Confederation would collapse, and if it did, they'd swoop back in. Benjamin Franklin said during the Revolution, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." And by 1787, that wasn't just a witty line.
Constitution time.
It was the choice they actually faced. So in May of that year, delegates met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Their job was to create a real government that could hold the country together. But to do that, everyone in the room had to agree. And slavery was a deal breaker.
Everyone had to compromise. Yeah, slavery, it just wasn't the first priority. It wasn't that slavery wasn't a priority. Now, they do make a deal on it for the history of slavery. See if he gets to it with the 20 years kind of deadline.
The convention was a negotiation between states with completely different economies. The northern states were moving towards trade and early manufacturing. The southern states, they ran plantation
industrialization's begun,
entirely dependent on slave labor. Some of those states made it clear they needed slavery protections. The South had the votes and the willingness to walk, and that meant no union, no country at all. So the founding fathers made calculated compromises that protected slavery in the Constitution. Of course, they didn't use the word. They used euphemisms like other persons and person held to service or labor. One of the things that came out of the negotiations was the 3/5 compromise, which gave slave states more political power by counting slaves towards representation.
Right.
Under that compromise, every 5 slaves counted as 3 persons when calculating how many congressional seats or electoral votes a state got. Of course, the slaves couldn't vote and they had 0 rights, but they gave their states extra power.
Right.
I mean, President Jefferson likely won the presidency in 1800 because of those extra electoral votes. And for the first 32 of 36 years under the Constitution, the president was a slave-holding white man from Virginia.
Yeah. Well, Virginia was basically had become like a breeding colony. It was like 90% of the population was slaves. Now, when he gets to the other part of the compromise here, though,
They also had a clause that Congress couldn't touch the importation of slaves until 1808.
20 years, basically saying there could be 20 more years of importation of slaves. Because the idea was that even with that only being 3/5 when it comes to representation, if you keep importing slaves and the children of slaves are slaves, eventually those numbers are just going to grow and grow and grow to the fact that they'll have all the representatives in Congress. So import for a while and importation of slavery getting down a little bit, it's starting to slow down a little bit, but it actually ramps back up though, interestingly, with the invention of the cotton gin, which revolutionized the cotton industry and made it so valuable because the first agricultural, real profitable product in North America was actually tobacco first. But thanks, Eli Whitney.
The Constitution explicitly blocked any amendment that might change that protection during those 20 years. The fugitive slave provision required states to return escaped slaves, even if they'd fled to free states.
That's what I was saying earlier.
So the federal government essentially became the enforcement arm of slavery. Every one of those concessions was the price of building one united country. But while the convention was protecting slavery in some places, Congress was banning it in others. In the same year as the Constitutional Convention, Congress banned slavery in what would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It created the first large region of guaranteed free states, and decades later, that helped tip the balance of political power against slavery and in electing Abraham Lincoln.
Right. This is when the South is getting a little apprehensive about it, and as Western expansion, you get places like Texas and heading out to California and all that. They're going to want the slave rights to continue. So see what we get here. Then they just do, when they would admit a new state, they would do, 2 at a time and want to be a free state, want to be a slave state. And it really just kicks the can down the river till inevitably had to be solved. There's so many presidents that did that.
So interestingly, many founders sincerely believed that slavery would die out on its own. When you study the economics of slavery, you learn that there were serious costs that often made paid labor cheaper.
Yep. So, especially with industrialization. He made a whole video on that. You should definitely, maybe I'll link it as the next video on here. Check that one out. That one is really interesting. I really enjoyed, and it added a lot more to the depth of the abolition conversation of an aspect that just does not get talked about, the economics, as opposed to the moral quandary.
There were real reasons to think that the problem might just solve itself without tearing the country apart. But in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin.
Yep.
And instead of fading away, slavery exploded. The South went from producing just a few thousand bales of cotton in 1790 to over 4 million bales 70 years later.
I mean, it's profitable, which still means you need a lot of people. So what the cotton gin done is separate the seeds from the cotton, which is one of the things that had made cotton manufacturing so difficult and so time intensive. You just plucked them out, but now you had a device that separated them. So now it's profitable. You need more cotton pickers.
Cotton became more valuable than all other American exports combined.
And lumber, and tobacco.
With that, the slave population grew right along with it.
Yeah. From
about 700,000 people to nearly 4 million within the same time period. The price of slaves tripled, and the slave trade became a massive industry. The bet that slavery would die out on its own was wrong, and it took a war that killed over 600,000 people to settle what politics couldn't. Hey, as always, if I mess up something serious here, let me know. I'll fix it in the comments and in a description box. You can also find my sources and notes down there. Okay, so here's an interesting question.
Yeah.
What if the founding fathers said no to slavery?
So my first thing was one of two things. Either the U.S. would have immediately become two states, one that protected slavery and one didn't, or you would have had a civil war back in the 1780s. That's what my original thought was. Let's see what he says.
Told the South, no deal. So some of this we can be pretty confident about, some of it a bit less so. Almost certainly, the South walks out. The Union fragments before it starts. And remember, without the South, the Revolutionary War probably wouldn't have succeeded in the first place.
I mean, I feel like still would have had one because they still both, you're going to want independence, but I just feel like it then would have turned into a civil conflict immediately.
The Revolution needed all the men and money the colonies had. Britain was still the most powerful empire on earth, and it was still actively looking for ways to reassert control or at least keep the former colonies weak and divided.
Mm-hmm. Now, remember, a lot of slaves were rooting for the British in this because the British, trying to get support, were saying that they would abolish slavery, They would free the slaves, if they had won this. And to recruit Native Americans would do more Native American protection. So didn't work out for them.
Without Southern manpower, resources, and territory, the Northern colonies probably couldn't sustain independence. It's very likely that Britain would pick off individual colonies, negotiate agreements that kept them dependent, or simply wait out until they collapsed under their own weight.
Yeah, I mean, would they collapse? I mean, they'd still be I think a decently viable country. Obviously not the superpower that gets its just huge economic boost from slavery like the US did, but would it have collapsed? I don't know. I'm not convinced.
There's no United States. Maybe a Northern Confederation, maybe separate countries of Massachusetts and New York, or smaller confederacies. But without the South's population and economic resources, they'd be vulnerable.
True.
And here's a part that makes it contradictory. And
we did see the U.S. was vulnerable with the War of 1812, which is, they're 20 years after all this settles.
Uncomfortable. Slavery probably wouldn't have just persisted in the South through 1860. The odds are good that it would have lasted longer. Some countries, like Cuba and Brazil, they didn't end slavery until the late 1800s.
Well, and what they would have been doing was exporting all the raw goods. They may not be doing all the factory stuff. They would be reliant just on exporting. I don't know if they would have been able to start building their own factories and stuff. Maybe. I mean, maybe they get the capital for it, but that's assuming that the South does become independent. So that this is all after the American Revolution and all the states are now free. Now, for some reason, the South stayed like a colony, I guess, of the British. Then, you definitely wouldn't have had the industrialization would not have happened down South, because that's not what the British were into. They want to industrialize. They want to get the raw resources and make the money and do the manufacturing, back in Europe. That was their goal, because that's how you maximize profits. And it creates a dependency of your colonies, which was integral for the British Empire, for them to be dependent on you.
Some countries, like Cuba and Brazil, they didn't end slavery until the late 1800s.
Right.
A stronger independent South with no federal government forcing the issue, it's very likely that they could have maintained slavery into the early 1900s. Now, there are counter-arguments to this, and some historians believe that the Union actually prolonged slavery and that a weakened South would have had to abandon it earlier, but most disagree.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what you guys, how long does slavery persist in the South if they didn't have, the Civil War and the pressure from the North? It's a good question. I haven't thought about how long. Definitely longer. I gotta circle back to that. Let's hear what he says.
Slavery and that weakened South would have had to abandon it earlier, but most disagree. What we know for sure is that the Founders' Compromise didn't solve slavery, but it did build the institution that did.
I mean, not really, though. I mean, what the Founding Fathers didn't do that, because they didn't abolish slavery. They allowed it to even importation to even happen for another 20 years. And if he's going to talk about how, 80 years later, you put out the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, those didn't, in actuality, end slavery. It took a war. It was the war that ended it. Let's see where he goes with this.
The federal government they created became the mechanism that ended slavery 78 years after it was formed.
The war
That
did.
union produced Abraham Lincoln,
Okay.
the Emancipation Proclamation, and a constitution that added the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery nationwide.
Well, we're getting very indirect then, because you're talking about a whole other generation later on that does that. The Emancipation Proclamation, well, we got to talk about this, because it was a political tool to separate and cut off the South from getting foreign support in the war. The countries, looking at the Civil War, were kind of wondering, okay, what is it about? What is it officially about? And when the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, which frees the slaves only in open rebellion against the North, it doesn't mean that that actually changed the institution of slavery. It didn't do that. It took an actual completing of the war. Now, what this did is made it complicated for foreign countries that, somebody had banned slavery, like the British, for example, being the biggest ones who did it in the 1830s. If they were going to support the South, that made them look very bad, because you're supporting the slave side, that they could actually have slaves. It was meant to cut them off from that foreign influence. That's the biggest effect the Emancipation Proclamation had. It's not, it's not like Lincoln, put this out and just thought that now all of a sudden the slave plantation owners are just going to walk up their slaves and be like, oh, this guy we don't accept as an authority just put out this piece of paper. Oh, I guess you're free now. Go ahead. See you later. That's not what happened. And same with the 13th Amendment. It still took the fighting of the war to actually enforce it. And not even just that, ending the war. It took the years of the Reconstruction. I mean, federal troops in the North were down in the South for years trying to enforce this stuff. So, I mean, saying that they created the institution to do this, I mean, indirectly, but it was the war more than anything.
Constitution that added the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery.
Another tool for, the war.
So yes, the Union the founders built was flawed from the start, but the alternative was likely no country at all and more human suffering.
Or two countries immediately. That's what I think.
Less. And like most historical issues,
is a possibility.
Even the ones that seem obvious, it's all more complicated than we'd like to admit.
Always.
Hey, if you want to deep dive into this issue further, the elimination of slavery in the world goes much further than Lincoln and the U.S. There's a fascinating story behind why the world abandoned slavery. I mean, for the non-slaves, it seemed like a pretty good deal. And it's complicated. It was a combination of a new morality, economic changes, and a crusade of one country, not the United States.
Referring to the British there, but there are other places that already banned slavery before the British did. But anyway, this video right here up in the top left is the one I was talking about. Check this one out, watch this, and then come watch my commentary video on it. It's really good because it does bring in the economic influence of how it was probably it was a stronger force than just some kind of like awakening to the immorality of slavery being the driving force. That was attached to the economic incentive of industrialization, making slavery almost obsolete and not cost efficient, which again is an argument in a conversation that doesn't happen enough when you talk about the end of slavery in the modern era.
Again, the truth is never simple. Thanks for watching. I hope I did a fair job at this. I hope you found it worth your time. See you next time.
Final thoughts. All right. So the thesis there was not, I mean, it was basically what I had figured, that they would say that, slavery was such an important institution, at the time of independence, that it was just kind of lower, I guess, on the priority list. That's how I probably would have worded it and really approached it that way, that it wasn't the number one priority. Like, it was something that was very important, obviously, and they had to address something about it, which they do with the 3/5 compromise and the end of the importation of slaves 20 years out. But yeah, it's good to get more of that nuance and bring that into the conversation here. So, all right, guys, thanks again for hanging out with me. We'll see you next time. Bye.